You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 21st of May 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, less than 2 weeks before Mexico goes to the polls, the country is as divided down the middle as ever when it comes to the big issues such as security. We'll look ahead to a fortnight of protest and polarisation. Also ahead, Emmanuel Macron's efforts to contain violence in the Pacific Ocean territory of New Caledonia have yet to come to much. So what will it take for the violence and rioting to end? All that plus a rise in support for a female emperor in Japan, the papers and the fashion news too. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. The Israeli Prime Minister has condemned the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court for requesting warrants for his arrest, for the arrest of his defence chief and of 3 Hamas leaders over alleged war crimes. Ukraine's president has accused Western allies of taking too long to make key decisions in their support of Kyiv's war against Russia. And Iran's supreme leader has announced 5 days of mourning after the country's president Ebrahim Raisi died in a helicopter crash. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, there are less than 2 weeks remaining until Mexico joins the ranks of those countries holding major elections this year. Almost 100 million people will be eligible to vote for their next president. As it stands, and comfortably ahead in the opinion polls by 25 points, is Claudia Sheinbaum of the ruling Morena party. The opposition presidential candidate, Xochitl Gálvez, is trying to close the gap, but neither seem to be galvanising the public spirit. There are regular large protests in the capital, Mexico City. So let's begin today's programme with a look ahead to elections in the 15th largest economy in the world. And to do so, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Andrew Thompson, journalist and political risk analyst specialising in Latin America. Welcome back, Andrew. Good morning.
Good morning.
So this is a very big election. So just take us through who the candidates are.
Basically, it's a three-way race. Way out ahead, according to the opinion polls, is Claudia Sheinbaum for the ruling left-wing party. Second place is Xochitl Gálvez, who represents a left-to-right coalition of opposition parties. And third place is Jorge Maynes of the Citizens Movement, Movimiento Ciudadano, who is a kind of centre-left political party.
At the moment, Claudia Sheinbaum is as you say, comfortably ahead. She is from the ruling Morena party, isn't she? But that is not doing her an enormous amount of favours, given the fact that people are saying that she is just copying her predecessor.
I think that's true, but her predecessor, very controversial figure, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the current president, is capable of attracting strong support. And it does look at this stage as that large lead she's got in the opinion polls is to some degree a transfer of votes, a transfer of people who have been supporting the existing president.
Tell us a little bit about the main issues that are being debated here and why they seem to be causing such problems for the electorate. I mean, security is a huge concern, and the recent debates have really exposed the different candidates' positions, hasn't it?
Yes, I mean, to be unkind, perhaps, for the last 2 decades, Mexico has had pretty much a failed security policy and has been unable to stem very, very widespread violence connected to the drug exporting cartels. And in this campaign, essentially the government's position has been to continue existing policy, which is to try and avoid confrontation with the cartels. There's a famous slogan from the president, which is "Abrazos no balazos," which basically means hugs, not bullets. And he's been trying to fight violence by attacking the root causes through social reform and so on. But for a large number of Mexicans, it just isn't working. And I think the last survey of household survey shows that basically 2/3 of Mexicans feel that they are at risk of violence. So that's an incredibly high percentage. The opposition, Xochitl Galvez as the main opposition candidate, she is offering a harder line, but she's talked about opening up a mega prison and confronting the cartels rather than trying to accommodate them, which she accuses the current president of doing.
And this is something which is bringing people to the streets, isn't it?
It is. However, Mexico's always had a fairly lively history of street protests. The important one was last Sunday, day before yesterday, when there were demonstrations, tens of thousands of protesters involved in demonstrations around 80 cities in different parts of the country. That protest was called by a group of civil society organizations, lobby groups, NGOs, but it was essentially an opposition rally, and it gathered a significant but not a record number of people.
Tell us a little bit about how divided the country is. I mean, you talked about a lively protest culture, but the fact remains that if you have something like security where it's a pressing issue, everybody feels as if it could touch them, but you have two presidential candidates who are pushing in rather different directions. I mean, what does that mean for Mexico as a country?
I think the key thing it means is that Mexico will always be performing beneath its economic and social potential while it has such high levels of violence going on. I mean, the figures are, frankly, are awful. And you have about 30,000 people a year being murdered. And of those cases, very, very few get cleared up. So that does affect the life of Mexicans. It does affect how much you can protest, for example. So you will go on a protest in an urban area which is fairly secure, but there are parts of the country which are effectively no-go areas and, in reality, controlled by the cartels.
Claudia Sheinbaum has pledged to try to reconcile Mexicans in this way. How does she go about this if she wins?
Well, she's treading quite a delicate pathway in that she is promising continuity with existing policy, but she has also got to reserve room for her own initiatives. And so far, she's saying that she will continue with existing security policy, but for example, she's saying she was previously mayor of Mexico City, which is a massive city. It's over 20 million inhabitants. And she says that when she was mayor in her 5-year period, the number of murders went down. The trouble is that in Mexico, politicians are quite selective about which homicide statistics they cite, and there are different ways of reading it. So, for example, she argues that the current government has reduced the homicide rate from above 30,000 to somewhere below. However, the opposition says, well, there are ebbs and flows in the numbers, but this doesn't stop the fact that the current president has presided over the most violent period in Mexican history in terms of homicide rates.
How much is her predecessor helping or hindering proceedings and the way that the election is running? Because you mentioned there the efforts by Claudia Sheinbaum, but her predecessor, Manuel López Obrador, talks about his supporters as good people, and he pushes against the likes of reporters and businessmen and in what he calls individuals. And that doesn't necessarily help to create a united Mexico going into any kind of election.
No, it doesn't at all. AMLO, that's what he's called, his initials, AMLO. AMLO is, if you like, a showman, very, very effective, but a politician who needs to have an enemy. His discourse, if you like, is always about fighting, the right wingers, the conservatives, big business. He's made an art form, if you like, of doing this. He has a daily press conference, which usually lasts from 2 to 3 hours, and to put it unkindly, he rants and raves against this and that. And strangely, this kind of divisive approach does build a strong core base. In some ways, AMLO is quite like Donald Trump. The difference is that AMLO is a man of the left, but he uses similar techniques. He makes up data when the data is not there. He is a performer. And Claudia Sheinbaum, it will be a difficult transition for her because she is also left-wing, but much more intellectual, much more serious in her approach, which leads a number of Mexicans, including some on the opposition, to think that her presidency, if she wins, will have some advantages. It will be less of a show, if you like, and more serious in its focus.
And in that context, what kind of leader does Mexico currently need? Not just domestically to sort out its own issues, but to step up to fulfill its remit as the 15th biggest economy in the world?
It needs, among other things, a leader who can engage on economic issues. One way of looking at the Mexican story is that it has an incredible investment opportunity if only it can control some of the other things going on and, for example, reduce levels of violence. And that opportunity is nearshoring. The fact that many global companies are withdrawing assembly facilities from China and moving them to Mexico, which through the free trade agreement, the USMCA agreement, allows goods manufactured in Mexico to enter the US market on a duty-free basis. And that, if you like, is, whatever the expression is, the goose that lays the golden eggs for Mexico. And the economy has grown at about 2% a year recently, but there is the opportunity of increasing that growth rate to 3 or 4% as a long-term trend, which would allow, for example, further reduction in poverty rate and investment in social programs. And the next leader of Mexico needs to be someone who can identify that opportunity and, if you like, ruthlessly pursue it.
Andrew Thompson, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Now, this weekend saw the arrival of hundreds of French riot police in the Pacific Ocean territory of New Caledonia. Their arrival followed a series of violent protests over a proposed new law that will let French residents who've lived in New Caledonia for 10 years vote in provincial elections. Some local leaders fear the move will dilute the indigenous vote. Well, yesterday, the French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris called yet another meeting of his Defence and Security Council to try to get to grips with the violence, which has so far claimed the lives of at least 5 people. Well, I'm joined now by Philippe Marlière, who's Professor of French and European Politics at University College London. Good morning, Philippe.
Good morning.
So this is Macron's third meeting in a week, isn't it? The first was to declare a state of emergency and the second to authorise the deployment of reinforcement. So why was a third meeting needed?
Well, I think the third meeting in a week, which is quite a lot, was really to review the situation after, deciding to send reinforcements to help police forces on the ground to assess what the situation is there. I think some kind of order has been restored, but the situation remains fraught and difficult, unstable as well. I gathered this morning or yesterday residents from New Zealand, Australians, mostly tourists, started to be evacuated. So situation remains serious enough for non-nationals to leave the island. So I think Macron will want certainly now to restore peace. But I think this is a big ask. This is a big issue here because the discontent, if you like, of the indigenous population, the Kanak people, remains. And I think what they want above all is that Macron sort of gets back to his decision to unfreeze the electoral roll, deciding as out of the blue, it surprised everyone to let French residents who have been on the island for at least 10 years to give them the right to vote. And that's what triggered the current unrest.
He's clearly made a step here which has infuriated many people. But to what degree has the unrest been fermenting before these electoral reform plans arrived?
I think tension has always been rife on the island. I think if we get back to the 1980s when it all started, I think there were during that decades lots of trouble. And that led to very important two agreements, one in 1998 and one in 1988, and one in 1998, 10 years later. And I think they could be seen as peace agreements, if you like, between the French and the indigenous population, the Kanak, which allowed the indigenous population, more autonomy, and probably also with the 3 referenda for independence were organized recently. They were rejected by the population. That's why who can participate in election is a very sensitive issue for the Kanak population. And I think what you have, and Macron has been widely criticized in France, not simply in New Caledonia, not simply by the Kanak, for really unsettling a situation which so far was, stands, but without any trouble. And I think this decision really was seen as a very bad move because peace has been lost. And I think lots of people are speaking about the situation which they regard as a colonial situation. You have here an island which has been populated by the French people from the 19th century. Initially, it was a penal colony, so it was French criminals which were sent there. And progressively, that population, although still majority, 40% of the population is Kanak, only 20% comes from metropolitan France. But I think what the Kanak are seeing is that their rights, their autonomy being ever more diluted.
Tell us a little bit more about Macron's wider reputation as being able to manage not just the hexagon, but also the overseas territories, because the diversity of France is astonishing, isn't it?
Yes, there are actually several overseas territories in France, which all, by the way, came in support of New Caledonia, calling for really Macron to stop that decision. And so clearly it's a strange decision. France has those territories overseas, very far from metropolitan France. They are seen as geopolitical economic resources. But the trouble is most of that population, notably the indigenous population, live in extreme poverty. And for some, and that's the case in New Caledonia, I think they would want independence. And so, of course, France is willing to stay put. So hence the tension. And so far, Macron's achievements have been quite, I would say, mediocre. Look at the situation here. A few weeks or months ago, no one was talking about New Caledonia. And now there's tremendous unrest there. And people are even talking about civil war. So I think the situation is quite serious now.
So how does Macron end this sensitively?
I think probably a sensitive decision would be to stop that vote, which was passed by the National Assembly in Paris a few days ago, the vote deciding to unfreeze the electoral roll and who can vote in New Caledonia. I think that would be a gesture of appeasement. And I think he's got to do that. And his political opponents in Paris, in New Caledonia, even the mayor of Nouméa, the New Caledonia capital, just asked Macron to do that. So I think that's probably the next move for Macron.
And internationally, I mean, you mentioned the fact that there are flights going out to from Australia and New Zealand to evacuate its citizens from the territory. When you have international pushback, I think there had been complaints that the airport is currently closed to commercial flights because of the violence. What does that do for France's reputation internationally? The way it handles its international, the way it handles other people's citizens on its territory?
Well, it's never very good when a sort of democracy, such as France, treats its own people, because New Caledonia is French legally, treats in such a fashion, and the reaction has been very heavy-handed. For the time being, police forces, reinforcements have been sent to put down the barricades, on the main road between the international airport and the capital. It's a very important access to, and they've done that. But I think they haven't resolved anything. The political tension is still there, the unrest is still there, and the anger is still there. So it's a very bad situation for France, and I think, of course, its neighbours, to start with Australia and New Zealand, will be very critical of what Macron's been doing.
Philippe Marlière, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme, we look at how Japan's appetite is growing for a female emperor. Plus, we hear the latest fashion news too. That's all coming up on The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Let's continue with today's newspapers. I'm delighted to say that joining me in the studio is Terry Stiasny, the political journalist and author. Good morning, Terry.
Good morning.
How's world in the Stiasny household?
It's a little bit stressful. We have lots of exams going on. Everybody has exams or deadlines, or so, yeah.
And what are you doing in sort of like trying to hold this all together? I know in our house we have a lot of post-it notes on walls with French and German words.
Yes, lots of post-it notes are a big thing, and lots of food. Food is
so much food. So, right, step out of that domestic chaos and bring us a little bit of
cheerful, I'm afraid,
bit of journalistic order here now.
Yes.
Right, tell us, the papers here in the United Kingdom have been focused very much on a story which dates back decades, doesn't it? But is only now coming to light.
Yes, and if you look at all the front pages of the papers in the UK this morning, they almost all go with the same headline, which is a day of shame for the British state. And that is a line from the apology from the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, for what's been called the infected blood scandal. And yes, as you say, this is something I can't quite believe that this people were in government were warned about this before the National Health Service was set up in 1948, the danger of infected blood being passed on to people who were given blood transfusions. Now, that was, in the days before HIV, but over the decades. And this inquiry looked into what happened between the 1970s and the 1990s and looked at how thousands of people had been given blood transfusions that were infected with various things, HIV, hepatitis C. Over the years, more than 3,000 people have died. People are still dying. And the inquiry, which has been looking into this for the last 6 years, has basically found, yes, there's a cover-up. And there's an amazing line from the judge who wrote this report saying, the answer to the question, was there a cover-up, is that there has been, not in the sense of a handful of people plotting in an orchestrated conspiracy to mislead, but in a way that was more subtle, more pervasive and more chilling in its implications.
In what way what does that mean? I mean, when you think of a cover-up, you do think of just about 3 or 4 people deciding, going into a room and saying, right, we'll keep a lid on this. But the fact that it seemed to be more endemic in the way that this was handled from top to bottom.
Yes, it just seemed to be that not only doctors within the health service, scientists, civil servants, and the advice that they gave to ministers, everybody seemed to have decided that this wasn't a problem, that people were told that they were being given the best treatments available, people were told that everything was fine. And it has taken, as with many other scandals in the UK at the moment, groups of people campaigning and saying, this was not fine. We were not told the truth. Our family has been devastated by this. And, reading really and hearing the testimony from people that spoke to the inquiry, it's really hard to believe that there's so many people have been standing up for so long and saying there was something wrong about this and something should be done. And finally, although, Rishi Sunak gave a very sincere apology to Parliament, he said there will be compensation for the people that are affected by this. But I think there's a real question of trust here at the moment in the institutions and in how people deal with issues like this.
Let's move on to a story which has made the papers absolutely everywhere. And this is the fact that yesterday the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court said that there are grounds to issue arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, and I think it's his Defence Minister, and 3 leaders of Hamas, wanted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. This has caused the most polarised reaction you could imagine. I mean, Joe Biden's come out saying that this is, an absolutely dreadful idea.
Yes, it is very interesting to see the reaction both in the US and the UK saying that they think this is not a good way to go about things at this moment. And as you say, I mean, this is a sort of a preliminary step. So this is the chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, who's a British barrister, Karim Khan, said that he wants to have these arrest warrants. That hasn't happened yet. He has to go before a panel of other judges to present his evidence in these cases and say why there should be these arrest warrants. Benjamin Netanyahu, as you would expect, has reacted very angrily to this. He's even invoked anti-Semitism and blood libels and calling it a moral outrage, really sort of, really absolutely furious about this. And Hamas are not best pleased either, as you would also expect. But of course, this is in every respect a complicated situation, and it's complicated further by Israel not being a member of the War Crimes Court, but the Palestinian territories are a member, and the court claims that they can have jurisdiction over Hamas attacks within Israel and Israeli actions in Gaza. So obviously it's a long way down the road before we might see anybody be arrested or let alone appear in court. But I think this is clearly going to be a very complicated case. But, in the short term, it's the politics of this and how it affects the situation on the ground, I think, that are going to be important.
It's also an interesting moment in the way that these stories are covered and actually the way that the stories are played out, because we have the New York Times saying Biden declares Israel military operation in Gaza is not genocide. That will be complicated. But also, what I find interesting is that the lawyers who supported who did the investigation and the research for the ICC, including Baroness Helena Kennedy, Lord Justice Fulford and Amal Clooney, have actually published an op-ed in the Financial Times today to explain what it says why we support ICC prosecutions for crimes in Israel and Gaza. It's one of those moments when actually traditional news media become that place where sensible, intelligent debate is taking place.
Yes, I mean, because I think, this is particularly a situation where there is inevitably going to be so much anger on both sides. And actually, the prosecutor himself has done an interview with CNN, and he is trying to, again, say, this is trying to calm things down to a certain extent, say this is not a witch hunt, this is not an emotional reaction to noise, this is a forensic process. And so he as they are trying to defend their process in the face of all of this political noise.
And indeed the idea that law is trying to sort of rein things in a bit. I mean, the essay that's written by the 5 lawyers says it's important to understand that the charges have nothing to do with the reasons for the conflict. The charges concern waging war in a manner that violates the long-established rules of international law. There is that feeling occasionally, isn't there, that when the law fails or falls so short in so many ways when there are areas of total conflict and when there seems to be lots of laws being broken and rules being broken.
Well, I think, and I think it's a fundamental question here. Do states really accept international law except when it suits them to do so. You've got countries here who aren't signed up members of the International Criminal Court, who aren't going to want to abide by what they say. And yes, is it force ultimately that wins, or is it international law that wins?
Right. Let's have a look at an article in Politico about, is Britain about to do a border deal with Gibraltar? That baffles me, and one wonders why they need to.
Well, yes, it's more. This is kind of interesting because Gibraltar, of course, in a British territory off the southern tip of Spain, and if you've ever been there trying to cross the border into Spain, there's always a queue. It's always something of a nightmare, and this has apparently, as you might not be surprised to hear, got worse since Brexit. Interestingly, people in Gibraltar voted by almost 96% to stay within the EU because they could see that this might happen. And there's big long queues at the border. So now they're saying, well, maybe we'll have a deal, and it'll be a bit like when you get on the Eurostar in France or Britain. You will go through your passport control away from the border. David Cameron, our new Foreign Secretary, has been working on this. But when he was talking to Conservative MPs, as again, not entirely surprising, you would expect that some of the pro-Brexit Conservative MPs are very upset about this. They think this, according to Politico, is a betrayal. Is Gibraltar going to have to align with the single market rules, and who is ultimately sovereign here? So they want to safeguard the sovereignty of Gibraltar, but the people who actually live in Gibraltar are saying, well, perhaps it would be easier if we just had an open border and a better system.
Finally, 30 seconds on Scarlett Johansson and AI.
30 seconds. Scarlett Johansson. They asked Scarlett Johansson, OpenAI, Sam Altman said, could we use your voice for an OpenAI, for the voice of our sort of robot, because he loves the film Her that Scarlett Johansson appeared in. Scarlett Johansson said, no, thank you very much. But now she is very upset because they have built a chatbot that has an eerily similar voice to hers. And so, this is the kind of thing that could put all of us out of work, even if we're not Scarlett Johansson. Could OpenAI create all of these voices that are sounding like actors or sounding like broadcasters? This is a big potential row.
Terry Stiasny, thank you as ever for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. The time here in London is 7:32. A quick look now at what else we're keeping an eye on today. The Israeli Prime Minister has condemned the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court for requesting warrants for his arrest, for the arrest of his defence chief and of 3 Hamas leaders over alleged war crimes. ICC prosecutor Karim Khan said he had reasonable grounds to believe that the 5 men bear criminal responsibility for crimes against humanity. Both Israel and Palestinian leaders have criticised Khan's decision. Ukraine's president has accused Western allies of taking too long to make key decisions in their support of Kyiv's war against Russia. Volodymyr Zelensky told Reuters news agency that he was pushing partners to get more directly involved in the war with Russia by helping to intercept Russian missiles over Ukraine. His call for action comes as Ukrainian forces are losing territory in the northeast and east of the country. And Iran's supreme leader has announced 5 days of mourning after the country's president, Ebrahim Raisi, died in a helicopter crash. President Raisi had been tipped as a potential successor to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. 15:33 in Tokyo, which is where we head now. Now, when Japan's Emperor Naruhito took office 5 years ago, he vowed to bring the country's royal family into the modern age. Moves have included the royal household joining the likes of Instagram. But while the look of the monarchy may be different, some structural elements remain unchanged. For example, succession may only happen through the male members of the family. But a survey in a Japanese newspaper this weekend suggested that public sentiment wants this to change. And to tell us more, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Richard Lloyd-Parry, Asia editor of The Times. Very good afternoon to you, Richard.
Good afternoon from Tokyo.
So what has this survey said then?
Well, this survey says, as you summarised it, that when asked, 90% of members of the public will be perfectly fine with a female emperor or reigning empress on the chrysanthemum throne. It's not all that surprising that when the similar question has been posed in the past, similar results have been obtained. But that is not going to happen, whatever the public thinks, because the opposition to changing the law and to a female line of succession is very much entrenched among conservative politicians who control the government of Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party.
Indeed, there was a majority decision inside this survey, which is just that the public sentiment wants women to be able to become emperors. But how entrenched in society is that unwillingness for this to happen?
Well, society at large wants it to happen, as that survey showed. The problem or the obstacle is the conservative traditionalist politicians in Japan's Liberal Democratic Party. This belief is rooted in, I suppose you'd have to call it Shinto mysticism. The supporters, the traditionalists, the supporters of the imperial family are very proud of the fact that it goes back thousands of years, and it gets a bit murky in the early days. You have emperors who are a little more than legendary figures, really. But still, they believe that this line is unbroken and that for all that time, it has passed through the male line of descent. And the idea is that the sort of the voodoo, the magic, the special quality that an emperor has, if you believe that, is passed through the male line. It's all about the Y chromosome, that male chromosome that preserves something. Nobody can quite say what it is, but perhaps it's one of those things that if it has to be explained to you, you're not Shinto enough to understand.
If you are in Japan now and you are trying to encourage Japanese society to effectively catch up with quite a lot of the rest of the world, how long do you think it is going to take to turn this large tanker around?
It's difficult to say. It's partly, I think, a generation thing among Japanese politicians. I wouldn't be too sniffy about, dismissing Japan as a place where women flourish. It's certainly true that in terms of representation in Parliament, for example, or in the upper tiers of society, and the upper tiers of business, on company boards, there is less representation by women at those high levels than in Western Europe or the US. But, Japan, as anyone who's visited here will know, is not a place where women take a back seat in many ways. So, it's not, this isn't really the crucial thing. It's a symbol more than anything else. It's a very special case. There aren't many monarchies in the world now. Japanese lovers of their monarchy are especially, attached to its unique qualities, its long line of descent, and this rule about men. Having said that, there are plenty of politicians. I was talking to one last week, a former prime minister called Mr. Noda, who do want things to change. And there are, at the moment, talks going on between the opposition and the government parties about how to do this. One of the problems is that the imperial family in Japan is just running out of people. And most importantly, they're running out of boys. There are only 5 men left in the royal family, imperial family, and only one of them is under 55. That's the the nephew of the current emperor, who's a 17-year-old boy called Hisahito. After that, there's no one else. So unless he pumps out, quite a lot of boys in short order with whoever chooses to become his wife, the line of descent literally will peter out. So the opposition and government parties are discussing ways, right now, that this could be changed, that the laws could be altered. There are various ideas. One is that they will adopt people into the family. Another is that women who currently must leave the imperial family when they marry will be allowed to stay in. But none of this directly addresses the problem of breeding more lads. So as time goes on, I think it's very likely that pressure will increase for a change in the law to allow an empress to occupy the throne.
Richard Lloyd-Parry in Tokyo, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. Now, Panama has voted José Raúl Mulino as its new president. Here, Andrew Mueller explains how, in reality, the endorsement belongs to his disqualified running mate, Ricardo Martinelli, a convicted criminal hiding under diplomatic asylum.
It is not entirely impossible that before this year is out, we will see Earth's mightiest, wealthiest nation elect as president an inmate of one of its prisons. Look, don't sound shocked. We've been into this. The framers of the United States Constitution, clever men though they were, seem not to have considered that a plurality of their fellow citizens might one day choose to award their highest office to a convicted felon, so there is no law against it. And indeed it has been attempted more than once, most successfully by Eugene Debs in 1920, who won nearly 1 million votes nationwide running on the Socialist Party ticket from the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, where he was doing a stretch for sedition, after urging resistance to the draft for World War I. In the meantime, any prisoners presently whiling away their sentences, cultivating aspirations of one day leading the nation which has banged them up, may draw an amount of inspiration from Panama, which has sort of elected a president who is sort of a prisoner. Well, sort of.
Fuerte el aplauso para el presidente de la República de Panamá!
The headline is that Panama's new president-elect is José Raúl Mulino, who has previously held posts including Minister of Justice, Minister of Public Security and Minister of Foreign Affairs. However, it is reasonable to suppose that many, if not most, of those of his fellow Panamanians who voted for him felt themselves to be voting for someone else entirely, that someone else being Ricardo Martinelli, who has for the last 3 months been hiding from the law in the Nicaraguan embassy in Panama City. At which point, the foreign desk explainer realises that it does have some explaining to do, but not before we reiterate our deeply felt animus against countries which simply name their capital city after the country, e.g. Panama City, Mexico City, Luxembourg City, Guatemala City, Kuwait City and Djibouti City, and don't think we're not seeing straight through San Salvador, Algiers and Brasilia. It's like your flag just being a blank sheet with the name of the country written on it, or calling your currency the money. Make a goddamn effort. Anyway, back to Ricardo Martinelli, presently the guest of Panama City's Embassy of Nicaragua, which is itself only just off the hook, redoubling up the name of the country and the capital, Managua, sharing a barely acceptable sequence of 4 corresponding letters. Martinelli has had one previous whack at being president of Panama from 2009 to 2014 and was, in fairness, very popular, despite or because of the eccentricities that led his own supporters to endow him with the nickname El Loco. However, Panama's somewhat parsimonious constitution limits presidents to 1 5-year term at a time, and after completing his, Martinelli returned to his pre-politics predilection for making large amounts of money. He had and/or has extensive interests in supermarkets, banking, energy and commodities, and is generally reckoned to be a billionaire. But last year, shortly after being selected as the presidential candidate of the conservative Realising Goals party, he was convicted over a scam by which he and fellow conspirators had appropriated public funds to buy a media group whose newspapers shortly thereafter pivoted to favourable coverage of Martinelli and his works. Martinelli was fined the thick end of $20 million, which probably wouldn't have bothered him over much, and sentenced to 10 years and change in the clink, which clearly did bother him a great deal, to the extent that in February he presented himself at the Nicaraguan embassy seeking asylum, along with his dog, Bruno, who, to judge by the steady stream of pictures Martinelli has since posted, is some sort of terrier, but we are no expert. Martinelli, it should be noted, denies the charges and others past and pending as a politically motivated witch hunt, etc. Nevertheless, they were sufficient for Panama's Supreme Court to disqualify him from the election, at which point Mulino stepped forward in his stead.
Aquí estamos porque hemos llegado con el voto mayoritario del pueblo panameño. Duélale a quien le duela.
Martinelli is probably not Moulinho's most pressing concern right now. The non-Martinelli shelf of Moulinho's in-tray is plenty to be getting on with. Panama is presently grappling with pretty much its biggest imaginable problem, which is that the waters of its canal are ebbing, a consequence of El Niño-caused drought. Crossings through the canal, which at peak manages 40% of all container traffic to and from the United States, have been reduced by nearly half. There have been 3-week queues to cross. Those ships which are allowed through are having to carry less. And while shipping traffic through the canal is sluggish, illegal migration through the Darien Gap, Panama's jungly border with Colombia, is thriving, with more than 500,000 people trekking towards the US last year. But to bring us back to where we came in, and with an eye on a bigger presidential election in November also featuring a legally compromised candidate, the question remains as to why people would knowingly vote for the proxy of a convicted criminal who is hiding in an embassy storage closet. It is, by this point in the democratic experiment, depressingly easy to answer. Martinelli is among that coterie of politicians who has discovered that dauntless, irrepressible shamelessness is kind of a superpower, and that a ready plurality of voters are absolutely on board for a victimhood narrative which enables them to excuse their own failures as the fault of a malevolent establishment. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
And my thanks to Andrew Muller for that report. For more deep dives into global affairs and analysis of the big issues of the week, tune into the Foreign Desk wherever you get your audio. You're listening to The Globalist live on Monocle Radio. It's time now to talk fashion with Rebecca Tay, retail expert and brand consultant. A very good morning to you, Rebecca.
Good morning, Emma. Nice to hear from you.
Good to have you with us. Rebecca, let's begin with Canada Goose and a change of creative director.
Yeah, this is quite an interesting one. It sort of came out of the blue, but Canada Goose, which is, not what we'll be wearing right now in the summer, but come winter and autumn, a lot of us will be wearing its down-filled coats. They've appointed its first ever creative director. So Haider Ackermann is well known in the fashion industry, but he's sort of not really done much because he was sort of ousted from his own brand. And it's an interesting choice, I think, for Canada Goose itself. Not very aligned, I would say, but making it kind of hitting the news waves, I suppose, for that reason.
In what way do you say that it's not terribly aligned?
I think Haider is, he's probably best known for dressing people like Tilda Swinton and Timothée Chalamet. So he's very artistic. He's Colombian, but he's French-based, based in Paris. He's sort of got a kind of couture-like sensibility. And then Canada Goose is about as utilitarian as it gets. So they've sort of prided themselves for always being made in Canada, but they kind of became famous in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s for being proper Antarctic expedition, really, extreme weather outerwear, really. So it's kind of an unlikely combination in that sense. So high fashion meets high sport, I suppose.
It is strange because, the way that you described the evolution of Canada Goose to now seeing them queuing down the street, down London's Regent Street, and people wearing them on the bus. But the utilitarian theme has remained with Canada Goose. What do you think is going to happen to its brand now that it has someone as couture as Haider Ackermann at the helm?
Yeah, I think it's very clear that Canada Goose is trying to compete with the likes of Moncler. So Moncler has sort of, held the same space, been very sport-oriented, very kind of performance-based. But in previous years, it's partnered with Simone Rocha, a lot more kind of fashion designers, and it also has its own sub-label Genius, which is really these kind of high fashion collaborations, coats that are still made for cold weather, but are a little bit more fashionable. And then the brands like North Face. So we all know the North Face as being very sporty, but a couple of years ago, they did a collaboration with Gucci, which really put them on the fashion map as well. So I think, there's a lot of pressure on sports brands to kind of reach new audiences, and I think Canada Goose is one of those brands, and this is its way of doing that now.
Let's move on to sort of a brilliant British heritage brand, Burberry, but it is absolutely struggling. Tell us what's going on there.
Yeah, this is a bit of a struggle. I think they've been struggling for the past few seasons. So it's been about a year and a half since Daniel Lee joined the brand. They're sticking by him. They're sort of rolling out his new design into stores. I think there are something like 70 stores that have his new kind of concept in them. But they just announced their annual sales or their annual results, and they're down 4%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it was down more than, about 12% just on the quarter alone. So they are saying, like most other luxury brands, that it's due to kind of that sort of middle-class customer that is not as, is a little bit of more of an aspirational customer, so they haven't been as shielded from kind of the current economy. And then, of course, they're also blaming it on China and the U.S., so not as much shopping in China, especially in the shopping malls, I think they're saying, as they would like to see, and then definitely that kind of middle-class consumer in the U.S.
Indeed, and just looking at the figures, its share price has gone down by 47% in the last year. I mean, when you get to that stage, I mean, how much confidence is there in Burberry that it will be able to pull itself back?
I know, it's admirable, I suppose. The CEO, Jonathan Ackroyd, is still really kind of saying, he's being quite transparent that the concerns are in China, and he says that they are aggressively growing their marketing. They're really kind of leaning into its British heritage, which has been a strong draw for Chinese customers in the past. So he knows that will continue to be the case. They were also saying that in the UK alone, some of those sales that dropped were because of the changes to the VAT. So they haven't specifically said, but obviously with the new government and the election coming up, potentially they're saying that could change. But yeah, they're sort of sticking by their story that it's sort of the general luxury sector in kind of overall. It's not just Burberry. It's also, Ferragamo, Kering, Valentino. The only brands that haven't really been hit the same way are Hermes, essentially, and a little bit at LVMH as well.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what LVMH could do, because there's quite a lot of speculation that with Burberry in the situation that it is, it would be an absolutely ripe candidate for LVMH to bring it into its fold.
Yeah, definitely. I think LVMH are sort of always looking. They're kind of always they're sort of always looking for who else to kind of acquire or who else is sort of out there. I think when they took on Tiffany, for example, a few years ago, that was the biggest news for a long time, for about 2 years, that acquisition. And there's been some change at LVMH as well. So the former Louis Vuitton CEO has stepped back. There's a lot of talk about Bernard Arnault and his succession plan. He's got, I think, 5 or 6 children, and a few of them are already in leadership roles at various houses at LVMH. And now Delphine, his daughter, who is the current Dior CEO, has stepped into the former Louis Vuitton role as well. So they're saying it's sort of just a temporary measure, but there's definitely a lot of appetite to kind of look at other brands that are available. They already have stakes at, Celine, Fendi, Loewe, Dior. So many of the brands that we know of as luxury brands in that space are already LVMH owned. So you're right, Burberry could potentially be one that they have their eyes on.
Finally, tell us about Roksanda as well, another British-based label which has found itself in an absolute mess. It's found a buyer.
Yes, this is an interesting one. I love Roksanda personally. I've always loved her use of color. So she was founded in almost 20 years ago in 2005, and it's Roksanda Lynchik herself. She'd faced the same problems, I think, since COVID, probably that everybody else had faced, really tough market. And she essentially had said, we're sort of going under administration. And then just last week, they found a buyer. So a company called The Brand Group has taken them on. She will actually remain as creative director as well. So I think it's an interesting, we're all hopeful that it'll save the brand, and the fact that she's staying there means that hopefully we can see some of those same sort of brilliant, beautiful designs coming out as well. And it's a good group as well because they have quite a lot of resources in terms of sort of supply chain and manufacturing. So there might be some changes in terms of how her product and her collections are made. But hopefully they have the sort of expertise and connections to help kind of bolster the brand now going into its 20th year, essentially.
Rebecca Tay, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests. Thanks to our producers, Tom Webb, Gunnar Gronled and Vincent McAviney. Our researcher was George Ruskin and our studio manager was Steph Chungu. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.